So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this latest webinar. For those of you who are new to these regular sessions, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. Insignia is a specialist crisis management consultancy. We help organisations to plan, train, exercise, and sometimes handle the worst day of their organisational lives. And today, we're looking specifically at the concept of reputational risk and the implications of that for crisis communication and crisis management. We're going to take a look at what this thing, reputational risk, is, why it is becoming more important, its impact, and then some of the things that you can be thinking about and doing to reduce your vulnerability to this what I think is a very critical risk type. We'll be running for the next 45 to 60 minutes, as always, a commitment that we will finish by 2 o'clock UK at the latest. And as always, please do post any questions that you may have via the question or chat panes, and we will endeavour to deal with those at the end of the presentation. So we scheduled this webinar around about a month ago, and in the month that's gone by, there's been some very interesting research and some very relevant cases which I think perfectly set the context for what we're about to talk about. So let me share some of those with you. So just last month, BSI issued its Organizational Resilience Index, which looks at a whole swathe of risk types. It was a piece of research which talked to a wide range of organizations, and their finding was that organizations perceive reputational risk as the single most important organizational resilience element. A little bit of texture to that. What they did is, based on their research, they ranked how well organizations were performing in terms of organizational resilience, and they also ranked them in terms of how important they felt those elements of organizational resilience were. If you look at the right-hand column, first of all, the importance rank, you will see that per the previous slide, organizations overall of all kinds are viewing reputational risk as the most important of all. But when you look at the left-hand column, which is really how effectively those organizations feel they are performing in terms of those areas, reputational risk only comes in at number 9 in terms of how well that risk is being managed. And this is also illustrated via this matrix. Again, it's just a slightly different way of looking at that previous table. Reputational risk you will see halfway down on the right-hand side, which indicates that it is perceived as incredibly important, the most important element. But again, in terms of how organizations are performing in terms of managing that risk, there is still significant ground to be made up compared with other important areas like financial aspects, leadership, vision, and purpose. So, summary is organizations recognizing that reputational risk is incredibly important, but also recognizing that as it stands, they are not as resilient in this area as they would like to be. Now, when I look back at some cases over the years and in the years that I've been involved in crisis management, a number of the very high profile crises have focused on operational incidents. And I guess over the last decade, the one that probably was the biggest of all was the BP Gulf oil spill in 2010. very much an operational incident, which ultimately had reputational impacts as well. But it was an event, an incident, something that happened, which was a crisis event. What we've seen more of over the last 8 to 10 years are these new reputational risks creating crises, which tend to be to do with ethics, integrity, trust, behavior. Examples include News International phone hacking back in 2011, which ultimately caused the News of the World to cease to exist. Little bit more recently in 2014, Tesco's accounting issues, which of course are back in the news at the moment with the 3 senior managers currently in court. Volkswagen's emissions scandal, the fiddling of the emissions figures, which has done enormous damage to a well-trusted brand, indeed potentially the best trusted automotive brand. Issues like 0 hours contracts providing challenges for retailers and other organisations, among them Sports Direct. And then earlier this year, the deplaning of a passenger from a United Airlines flight, which, as you will all recall, went viral. There's no one I speak to that has not seen the video of the passenger being removed, or certainly who is not aware of this issue which United Airlines faced. None of the previous examples, nor this one, were incident related in the conventional sense. They were not to do with accidents, terrorism, explosions, fires, environmental incidents. They were to do with behaviours, customer service issues, management behaviour issues, culture, ethics, integrity. And if we just think about this United Airlines example in particular, I'm confident that if United Airlines were to have the misfortune of an accident or maybe even a terrorist incident, that they will have drilled and rehearsed and planned so that they do all of the right things to respond to that incident. But what's wrong-footed them here is effectively a customer service situation, magnified, of course, by social media. And they've found that far harder to deal with. So this blindsiding of the non-obvious crisis types is something that all organizations needs to be thinking about. And that's particularly true if the incident or issue itself strikes right at the heart of your values. And this is a piece of research that those of you who've been on previous webinars will have probably seen, but this is research done by Oxford Metrica, which shows the financial impact of a crisis event in the year following that incident or issue occurring. And you'll see that on the blue line at the top, there are organizations that respond well, regain, and in fact sometimes even enhance their value, compared with the red line, which shows what happens if you mishandle a crisis. And particularly your response in the first 2 or 3 days is critical to determining which of those 2 lines that you end up on. What's really interesting, though, is that Oxford Metrica found that where crises strike at the very heart of an organization's values, that is where the dip in the value of the organization can be most acute. So there is a higher chance of you ending up on the red downward curve if the crisis is about your values, your integrity, your culture, your behaviors, particularly if you professed to be a different kind of organization compared with what is being revealed by the crisis that is unfolding. And I think this has always applied to organizations with fantastic reputations. For example, Virgin. And an easy example, but it's true. Virgin, which has a reputation for superb customer service, needs to exemplify those qualities of customer service in the way that it responds to a crisis. But even organizations which don't have unblemished reputations are now feeling the impact of reputational risk. And here are three examples of organizations who have grappled with this literally over the last 3 to 5 weeks. Firstly, Uber and their banning from London streets. This is a quote from a couple of weeks ago from Uber's CEO saying in response to what had happened, "The truth is that there is a high cost to a bad reputation. It really matters what people think of us. Going forward, it's critical that we act with integrity in everything we do. That doesn't mean abandoning our principles, but rather building trust through our actions and our behavior." So really recognizing the value of reputation and the critical importance of reputational risk. And for the ultimate maverick of the skies, Michael O'Leary and Ryanair, even Michael O'Leary had to acknowledge that the cancellation of flights that we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks is having a reputational impact on the organization. And in fact, it was fascinating to hear him say that the actual financial cost of the reputation of the crisis was manageable, but the reputational impact was actually much bigger. And this is an organization which has been happy to trade with a mixed reputation over the years, really just trading on cheap prices, and being that challenger against the more established airlines. Even brands like this are now having to wake up to the idea that reputation is important, and reputational risk can damage or even destroy what you have built up. And I guess the most dramatic example over the last month is that of Bell Pottinger, the PR firm who have gone into administration due to controversy about its relationships with the Gupta family in South Africa. This is a reputational crisis, pure and simple, that has caused an organization which was hugely successful, well respected, well established, to go into administration over a relatively short period of time, and is, as I say, the ultimate example of the damage that a reputational crisis can do. Clearly, it doesn't help if your role in life is to help other organizations protect their reputations. A couple of the characteristics of the reputational crisis that I would draw your attention to. Many of them are self-imposed. They are caused by the organization itself, not by an external event coming from left field and hitting the organization. It's about the behaviors, the way of doing business, the culture of the organization. They are the kinds of risks which we create ourselves. But because of that, the reputational crisis can be more damaging than one of those that comes from outer space, one of those where we are almost the victim of a crisis rather than the creator of it. So it's all about what do people expect of you, what do stakeholders expect of you, and how do you respond in response to one of these major crises hitting you. Because the impact can be huge. Unlike buildings or other assets of an organization, you only have one reputation. You can't have a backup in reserve. You can't buy a new one. You can't fully insure your reputational. And as a consequence of that, a reputational crisis really is the acid test of management, who you really are and what you stand for. So that's the context. What can we do to protect ourselves, or indeed even better, prevent a reputational crisis occurring at all? And at this point, I would just remind you again, if you have any questions, do please feel free to post those via the chat box or the question pane on your panel on the right-hand side of your screens. So, what can we do to reduce the chance of this kind of a crisis affecting us, and or what plans can we have in place to respond if it does? Well, it all starts with, oh my goodness, that's gone mad. With you in a minute. Right, I'm not sure what is going on here, but let me just try and get back onto the correct slide. Okay, it doesn't seem to want to do that. So let me try and manage my crisis. Okay, it appears that disaster has been averted. So, what can we do to prevent a crisis of this type? Well, it all begins with people and culture, because these types of risks are to do with behaviours, people and culture. Preventing them begins with people and culture too. And the most important thing that you can do is secure the support and active engagement of your leadership team in preventing a reputational crisis, ideally right from the very top, from the CEO, managing director, or organizational leader, to recognize that this is a critical element for them to play a key part in exemplifying behaviors that reinforce your reputation rather than undermine it, and indeed to play a key part in championing the crisis planning, training and exercising program. The second thing is getting all of these internal stakeholders who play a part in crisis management planning onto the same page. One of the things that we sometimes see with organizations where, for example, security personnel lead the crisis management planning program is that there is an over-focus on those security-related risks, kidnapping, terrorism, etc. It's critically important that those kinds of risks are planned for, but not to the exclusion of the softer reputational risks. Again, building alliances with colleagues, legal colleagues, is also critical, just to ensure that an overly legalistic approach isn't actually having significant impacts in terms of raising your reputational risk. The third broader point is creating a crisis resilient culture and embedding it throughout your organization. Now, there's a whole separate report on crisis culture which you can download from our website, but in summary, these are some of the factors to be aware of and some of the things that you can do to make you resilient to crisis, or rather resistant to crisis. And I think this particularly applies to reputational crises. Firstly, beware a centralized hierarchical structure where all the power is held in the center and there's a lack of empowerment at a more devolved level. That creates a greater potential for crisis. Secondly, ensure that high standards of governance are embedded and imposed. A number of these reputational crises are as a result of inadequate corporate governance. One could speculate that that may well be the case in the Bell Pottinger example, for instance. Enable, even encourage staff to challenge people of status or power. We're hearing in the Tesco court case allegations from the prosecution lawyer that whistleblowers or people with a different perspective on how the finances should be treated were not listened to. Now, we don't know yet whether that is true or not, but encouraging people to challenge people of high status or high power is important in order to nip potential crises in the bud. Beware misguided incentivization or target setting. In other words, if all of the goals and objectives of your senior managers are focused on financial performance rather than, for example, safety or customer care, don't be surprised if they cut corners to hit those financial targets, creating the potential for greater reputational risk. A crisis-resistant culture is one where the whole organization is alert to the potential for crisis. The opposite, the view that this could never happen to us, is a dangerous mindset. Don't overestimate your resilience. Simply believing that if something bad happens, you will get through it, as Bell Pottinger has found to its cost, is a high-risk strategy. Empower your front line. Whether you're a retailer, an airline, or a mining company, give people the opportunity to resolve problems quickly at source, or at the very least to escalate those problems or concerns quickly. Guard against denial or willful ignorance. This is really most powerfully applied to people in leadership roles who simply don't notice or decide not to notice that a problem is growing. The quicker a problem is spotted and dealt with, the smaller that problem has the potential to be. And another characteristic of a crisis-resistant culture is an organization which acts on near misses, minor incidents and issues. So an organization which has the view that, yep, something bad's happened, let's get back on with business as usual. That is an organization which is probably going to have another incident or issue in the not too distant future. The really crisis-resistant organizations review what's happened when there's been an incident or a near miss. They learn from those and they act on those learnings. So these are some of the steps and some of the characteristics that that shape a crisis-resistant organization with particular relevance to reputational risk. At a more practical level, what can you do in your planning to reduce your vulnerability to reputational risk? Well, clearly, the first thing to do is a reputational risk assessment. Identify where your reputation could be vulnerable, and in particular, what kinds of incidents, issues, or crises could do most damage to your reputation. You'll probably have some surprises if you've done a conventional risk assessment which focused more squarely on operational risks. We had an incident whereby a particular client thought that they had full knowledge of their risk landscape and also the prioritization. When they actually looked at the risk assessment through a reputational lens, actually that landscape was very different, and a crisis type, a risk type, which was only mid-ranking previously, became the most significant risk for them to manage because of the fact that ultimately it could do most damage to that organization's reputation and bring it to its knees. So reputational risk assessment is one of the critical first steps to understanding what's at stake and therefore what needs to be done. Scenario planning, playing through some of those priority reputational risks to understand how they could play out, what we could do to prevent them from playing out in that way, and what contingencies, planning and training we need to put in place to be sure that we're geared up to respond if they do emerge. And those materials, messages, channels and processes are some of the next steps that can be taken on the back of a reputational risk assessment and or scenario planning. Horizon scanning is also important as part of your planning activity. Being vigilant as to what's happening both within your own organization and outside of it. An organization which doesn't just have its head down, but which has its head up, looking for emerging trends and issues which could have a significant impact on its reputation. 0 hours, for example, was not a big issue 5 years ago. Now it's a major issue. The same could be said for the tax affairs of major corporations. So being mindful and being vigilant for what's coming down the track and what's changing out there is an important part of your planning for reputational risk. It's a message which you will have heard in previous webinars, but I would sincerely encourage you to rehearse, to actually give your team practice of grappling with reputational risks. And I do emphasize the word reputational there. Don't always do your exercises on an operational incident, a fire, an IT outage, an environmental incident, an accident. It's important that those are covered, but also think about the softer reputational risks, the management fraud, the staff whistleblower, the emerging social media incident, the rogue employee. These are some of the more difficult scenarios to deal with, and because of that, it's important that you rehearse for them as well as for the more obvious operational risks. So there are some of the things that you can be thinking about in terms of preparing, preventing and planning. A few thoughts on responding to reputational risks. Again, please do post any questions that you may have as we enter the final 10 minutes of the presentation. So, how should you respond to a reputational risk, a brewing reputational crisis? Well, as with all crises, but even more so, the first thing is to recognize what is really at stake here. And in a monumental, a big reputational crisis, the very existence of your organization can be at stake. So, not being in denial, recognizing that that is the case, and acting accordingly will be critical to a successful outcome. And what you also need to do is respond in a way which exemplifies your reputation and counterbalances the crisis itself. So, for example, if the reputational crisis focuses on a lack of transparency within the organization, your response to the crisis needs to be hugely transparent and open to exemplify the reputation which you previously had, but also to counteract the allegations and the inferences which are coming through because of the crisis. And again, one of my favorite crisis responses of recent years, the Alton Towers Smiler incident, I feel that they absolutely recognise that that accident was not just an operational incident, but one which could bring the whole park and indeed the whole of Merlin to its knees if the organisation didn't respond in the right way. And led by Nick Varney, the CEO, that is exactly what happened. Building on responding in a way which exemplifies your reputation, it's crucial in your response that you are true to your values. If you remember what I said looking at the Oxford Metrica slide about the organisations which suffer most are those that respond in a way contrary to their stated values. The flip side of that is your response must absolutely embody those values, and this is neatly summarised in a quote from Jenny Britton-Bauer, the owner of Jenny's Splendid Ice Creams, who, subsequent to a major product contamination issue, said, "Values exist in the great times, but they also exist in the shitty times. If you abandon those during the worst times, then they're not yours, really." So someone in the crisis management team, ideally your leader, needs to be saying, do you know what? This is what this organisation stands for, and as a result of that, this is how we are going to respond to this emerging incident. Sorry, I am again having one or two challenges with the presentation having a life of its own. So, what are some of the practical actions that need to be taken in response to a reputational crisis? Well, the first is the flip side of this recognition of what is at stake. Given that the whole future of the organisation may be at stake, that demands that the problem is addressed with commitment and urgency. In practical terms, that probably means communicating quickly. It means taking responsibility for what has happened, but critically taking responsibility for the actions required to put the situation right. This is not a situation where you should be hiding away or blaming some subcontractor for the problem. Given that reputational crises tend to be about people and behaviours, you want to have an emotional, personal, and empathetic response. You want to demonstrate passion and genuine human commitment to putting this situation right. So a robotic, overly media-trained spokesperson, for example, will not do you best service in a crisis of this type. You should instead deploy spokespeople who absolutely epitomise your brand and can defuse the crisis which is raging all around you. You need to update stakeholders regularly. I'd make a special point there talking about your own people. In a reputational crisis, your people will be asking of their leaders, are they competent to manage this crisis, and do they really care? They will feel hurt, worried, concerned about what has happened. They are probably seeing a picture of the organisation that they don't recognise. And so briefing your own people in particular regularly, firstly, to give them confidence and reassurance that you are doing the right things, but secondly, to activate them as ambassadors for the organisation is really important when you're grappling with a reputational risk. And assuming you have been successful in managing the situation, it's really important that you take all steps to prevent a recurrence. Most organisations will be forgiven for a single slip-up. When it becomes a series of incidents and issues and you become a repeat offender, it's much harder to forgive the organization. What that means is it is important that you take the learnings from the situation, that you don't just recognize them, but that you act upon them, and that you put additional steps and preventative measures in place to avoid it happening again in future. I'm going to finish the presentation with another quote, which you may well have seen on previous presentations, but I think it's really resonant in this context of reputational risk. And it's from Warren Buffett, who said, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently." So be aware of the power of reputational risk. Be aware that it has greater impact these days than it did 5 or 10 years ago. Make sure that those reputational risks are recognized in your planning, training, and exercising pre-crisis, and make sure that should one of those risks occur, you respond with speed, passion, conviction, and crucially, in line with your values. So that concludes the formal presentation. We've now got time for a few questions. So the first one here is, don't all crises have a reputational element? Yes, they do. I talked earlier on in the presentation about some of those operational crises and use BP as the example. Let's be clear, I am not saying that those operational crises no longer exist. They clearly do. Accident, incident, and event-led crises are still a crucial area to be planned for and to be responded to. And it is also true that those operational crises have a reputational element to them. And I guess the BP oil spill is a perfect example of that. It had both a massive operational challenge and an equally massive reputational challenge. What I do think is different is that there is an increasing number of pure reputation crises. Why is that? Well, I think people expect more of organizations these days. I think trust is such a highly prized asset, and the fact that it's in short supply with regard to businesses, I think means reputational crises are much more prevalent. And I guess the third element that plays into this is, again, social media. The transparency provided by social media means that the kinds of reputational incidents that maybe could be kept under wraps in the old days just can't be done nowadays. So yes, all crises have a reputational element, particularly if they're handled badly. You should still plan for the operational crisis, but you also need to be prepared for those purely reputational incidents. Second question, how does a reputational risk assessment differ from a normal risk assessment? Good question. So a reputational risk assessment looks at risk through a reputational lens. So the criteria that we're looking at is the extent to which a risk could damage our reputation. The other key element, certainly when we're running reputational risk assessments, is the ability to get people within the risk assessment to view the organization from the outside in. When you ask questions like, what kind of a crisis could a disgruntled employee cause for us? What kind of a crisis could a really hot investigative journalist cause for us? What kind of crisis could our most critical NGO cause for us? You suddenly get a whole load of new risks which were not identified via the conventional operational risk assessment. So in simple terms, it's by applying a reputational lens to the risk assessment and by taking an outside-in perspective to actually look at the risk landscape in a slightly different way. Another question, at what point should a company hold its hands up and say, sorry, for example, BP and Thomas Cook with the carbon monoxide deaths of the 2 children in Corfu? This is always a judgment call, and that's always the way with responding to a crisis. All of the training, all of the exercising, all of the planning is crucial to getting you prepared for a crisis, but it will still require someone to make a judgment and to make decisions when the heat is on. I would suggest that organisations in general should be more prepared to say sorry at an earlier point. We understand the tension between the legal risk that brings and the reputational benefit that it brings. But certainly if we look at the Thomas Cook example specifically, Thomas Cook spent 10 years trying to avoid saying sorry, and as a consequence, the story stayed in the public consciousness for that period of time, and the damage to the organisation and its reputation was all the more because of it. I would commend you all to read Justin King's analysis of that Thomas Cook incident. It's on the Thomas Cook website, and hats off to Thomas Cook for being the kind of organisation which is prepared to learn from a crisis. And surprise, surprise, one of Justin King's key insights and recommendations from the incident was that they took an overly legalistic approach, should have said sorry, should have shown empathy much earlier on. Final thought on that particular question. This is also where what happens before the crisis is so important. For example, I talked about building alliances with your legal colleagues. Doing that ahead of time will take some of the tension and some of the challenge out of those conversations under the heat of a crisis. We talked about scenario planning, working through some what ifs ahead of time is one way of helping to short circuit decision making in a crisis. So, saying in a scenario planning environment, would we be happy to say sorry at this point? Having a really good discussion about it, and then coming out with an in principle policy on when and how to say sorry, so that you're not making all of those decisions on the hoof. I should at this point say welcome back to Matt, who for the last half an hour has been on a fire alarm. So Matt's been doing a crisis test for real. I'm pleased to hear, Matt, that it was simply a test and that you're now back on the line. Okay, please feel free in the last 10 minutes or so to pose any further questions. I've got one more here, and it's why do organizations seem to struggle more to manage these reputational crises than the operational ones? I think in simple terms, these types of reputational crises tend to be more personal. They're about people rather than events. And we find it difficult both to talk about, plan for, and respond to these crises, which are about our culture, which are about our people, which are about the way that we operate, compared to something that's more physical, more operationally based. I think the really enlightened organizations and those which genuinely want to protect its reputation get beyond that discomfort and are prepared to embrace reputational risks, both as part of their planning and also as part of their actual crisis response. Okay, so I think that covers all of the questions that we have. So, quick headline to let you know that our next webinar will be at 1 o'clock on the 23rd of November. We've got a couple of irons in the fire with regard to what the topic will be, but that will be confirmed in the fullness of time. That the date itself is set, the 23rd of November, same time as this one, 1 o'clock UK. As we plan for our webinars for 2018, I'd love to hear from participants on this webinar for any topics, people or crisis management areas that you would like to see us discuss next year. So please do feel free to drop us a line with any suggestions. And with that, I will say thank you for joining us over the last 45 minutes or so. If you have any questions, further questions arising out of this session, do please feel free to drop me a line or give me a call. We will be sending out a link to a recording of the webinar if you'd like to listen to any of it again. And there is also a brand new blog post which gives some hints and tips on preparing for and dealing with reputational risks. So do please take a look at that. Thank you again for joining, and I wish you a quiet and crisis-free afternoon. Many thanks.